This is a book about air, or about atmosphere, or about gases, really. And Sam Kean is a Radiolab regular and a person I crazily admire almost pretty much from the get-go. So why don't we, the book is called Caesar's Last Breath. I guess we all know it was March 15th,
44 BC.
Yeah. And he's going to the Roman Forum to, I guess, answer petitions or something.
He was going to leave the next day. He was taken off for a trip or something.
Right.
So, yeah.
And then stuff happens.
So, something happened, yeah.
Yes. So why is this the title of your book, and what happens?
So it's kind of a classic chemistry physics problem. You ask someone, what are the odds that in your next breath right now, you're going to inhale a molecule that Julius Caesar breathed when he got assassinated in 44 BC? And it's kind of pulls you both ways, the question, because on the one hand, that seems so long ago, and it happened all the way across the world. The atmosphere is so big, a breath is so tiny. Like, how could any of that breath remain around? So it seems like the answer is zero. There could be zero molecules there. Then on the other hand, if you look at it from the molecular side, there are so many molecules in every breath we take. It's something like 25 sextillion, which is a 25 with 21 zeros after it, which no one can really wrap their head around. It's too big of a number to really comprehend, but it's a gigantic, gigantic number. And from that point of view, it seems almost inevitable. There are so many of these molecules that it seems like you have to breathe lots of them every time. So it's a question of whether the really big number wins or the really small number wins. And it turns out they almost exactly cancel each other out. And if you do all the math and look at all the assumptions, it seems that you're probably breathing in every single breath an average of one molecule that Caesar breathed, which is kind of amazing to think about, that someone who died over 2,000 years ago, that remnants of their breath are still floating around. And not only floating around, but they're going into and out of our lungs all the time. So that's where the title comes from.
It's not a very hygienic sort of. Wouldn't that apply to farts as well as...
Someone asked me that earlier, too. They wanted to know why wasn't it called Caesar's Last Fart or something like that. And the answer is, yeah, in a way, those things are still around in the atmosphere, and you're sort of breathing them. It's not comfortable to think about, but those other gases, though, are much more reactive. They're more likely to disappear and to kind of fall out of the air. Whereas when you're exhaling, most of it is nitrogen, which is a very hardy, very unreactive molecule. Once it gets into the air, it stays in the air for billions of years. So breath is the more appropriate one.
Does it matter, like, if I'm standing on the top of Mount Everest, or if I'm standing at the seashore at the level, or I'm standing in a deep valley, like in Death Valley, am I most likely to grab the atom from Caesar at sea level? Is that...
You might be more likely because you're probably going to be breathing in more molecules with each breath. So just because there are more, the air is denser down there, lower than it is higher. So.
And we're pretty sure about the math of this, that 25 sextillion molecules in a liter of air will if I go...
That was a big breath, so maybe 2 or 3.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And why did you decide to fall in love with gases? Because you could read this book and say, really, what you fell in love with was nuts, nutty people.
Nutty people, yeah.
The book is filled with nutty people and gas. I'm just wondering, were you more intrigued by the nutty people, or are gases your first real deep love here?
I think it was the nutty people. The stories are really the thing I kind of gravitate on, I focus on, and I want the science in there. The science is going to be in there, but it's really, if it's not a good story, then I'm probably not going to be as interested in it.
So let's just go to air itself. So if you were to ask yourself, like, Will, what is air? If you go back a few thousand years, Aristotle said, I know what it is. It's like it's the not earth, it's not fire, it's not water, it's air. It's one thing. It's always been there. It seems to be weightless. Are any of those things true? That it's one thing. It's always been there the same It doesn't weigh anything?
Yeah, no, none of those are
Yeah.
actually true, yeah.
Let me just ask about the weight. At one point you say if you drew a cylinder around the Eiffel Tower, the air around the Eiffel Tower weighs more than the metal that is the Eiffel Tower.
Yes, it does.
Really?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to imagine that air has any weight whatsoever, much less that it could be heavier than the
Yeah,
Eiffel
because
Tower.
if you had a suitcase with nothing in it but air, it would be empty.
It wouldn't be if it was actually empty. The suitcase would get crushed. It would,
Okay,
yeah.
that's right.
It would,
But it would seem like there's nothing added when there's no shirt in there. It's just air.
yeah.
But or let me put it this way. You at one point in this book you say humans have dumped roughly 2,500 trillion pounds of carbon dioxide into the air in 50 years. That's 1.6 million pounds per second. Think about how little gas weighs, and then appreciate how staggering these figures are. So when you read these things about how cars are putting pounds, tons of gas in the air, you mean tons. If you were to take all that gas and put it on a scale, it would weigh tons.
It would weigh tons, yeah. Like the molecules themselves would weigh that much.
So when you close your eyes and try to imagine how much gas we are producing into the sky, and it's 2,500 trillion tons over 50 years, that's just very hard to get your head
Yeah,
around.
the numbers are a little too big to. It's the national debt times, 10 or something like that, if that helps some.
Wow. What about height? How high is the atmosphere?
It's kind of arbitrary where you want to cut it off because it just sort of bleeds out into nothingness when you get up into space. But there are different levels of like the stratosphere, troposphere, up to about I think 50 miles or so, and then
50 miles, like here to Rutgers?
Yeah, it's weird. Like you think about that seems so high up in the you think of space, but it's not that far. Like you could drive your anti-gravity car up there in a day and be out in space.
In a day, I can do 50 miles in if it's a freeway. I can do it. If we were in Germany, I could do it in 40 minutes.
Yeah, to the edge of space, it's about 400 miles, so it's not that far.
What about the eternal? Like, is the air that we've got now the air that we've always had?
No, I talked in the book the air that we probably had about 4 distinct atmospheres in Earth's history, and the one we have today, obviously, is the last one, but it's an unusual one in some ways.
The first air was what exactly? So there's this ball of dust. It goes falls together, and you got your planet.
Yep.
And then, does anything gather around
There's
it?
a little tiny, it's a wispy little hydrogen-helium sphere. It's kind of left over from the sun, but very wispy, kind of this comb-over atmosphere, and then very quickly gets blown away into space. But it counts. It's a little bit of an atmosphere.
So that's beginning air.
Yeah.
Then later on, the Earth is being pounded by meteors and stuff, I guess. But there's there's the phrase "the big burp," which I remember hearing. So I imagine an Earth that is now loaded with gas on the inside, and it's belching out.
Yeah, you have these volcanic vents and fissures that basically there's gas building up underground, a lot of pressure. The early Earth was a little softer. The ground wasn't quite as settled yet, so they would tear open, and all these hot, nasty, reactive gases would come spewing out of the air, or spewing into the air. And those are really what formed the second atmosphere. A lot of ammonia, sulfur, smelly chemicals, a lot of carbon dioxide in them. So.
But the nitrogen and the oxygen that we're used to, not in abundance.
You get, the second atmosphere transitions into the third because you get a little tiny bit of nitrogen every single time. And all these hot, nasty gases, they end up reacting with things and they go away. Like carbon dioxide ends up dissolving into the sea. You get some minerals, things like that. Other gases react. But the nitrogen, even though it's a very tiny percentage, you get a little bit more each time. And it builds up very, very slowly over billions of years. And eventually nitrogen becomes the dominant gas in the atmosphere. But it's really a slow process.
At this point, as this second atmosphere is gathering, there's big thwacks occasionally.
Yeah, you get your meteors, asteroids, comets coming in, destroying things.
You
not
tell
a nice
a
place.
story I've never heard before, which is that the Earth got into a path around the sun, and then so did something else. on the same path.
A twin, almost.
A twin, yeah. And then there's two planets going around in the same orbit, and then we get rear-ended by this other one, which is called the Big Thwack.
Yep.
And is this I've never heard this. Is this a true
Yeah.
a theory that is?
Yeah, that's what geologists call it, the Big Thwack.
And what happens exactly? What's
So
the
it was
name of the one behind us?
They have given it a name. I can't remember off the top of my head. It was
Thea.
Thea. Okay. It was after some mythological god, I think, god of vengeance or something like that.
Or the bad driving god.
Yeah. And basically what happened is Earth and Thea, they collided with each other, and the Thea was a little smaller. It was about a Mars-sized body. So big, but a little smaller. It hit and basically vaporized itself in a huge, gigantic explosion, bigger than anything we've seen since then, bigger than anything we can imagine. And you had all of this vaporized rock and gas and metal kind of swirling around. And eventually some of it escaped into space, coalesced back, and that became our moon. So that is where our moon came from, was this destructive event that produced all this gas, went up into
so
space
the moon
and cooled down.
The moon is the after effect of a crash.
Of a crash, yeah.
Wow.
So it's not Thea itself, because that got vaporized, but it's Thea mixed with Earth that went up there.
So all right. So then the Earth, however, continues to belch and pour out things, but this time it now becomes a little bit more volcanic at this point.
Yep.
And then life takes over and starts to do things. I'm just on the volcano side. The first big story in this book is the story of a man, the first nut actually, a man named Harry Truman.
He's a good nut to start off. Yeah,
Yes.
Pretty nutty one.
Who is? I mean, we know who Harry Truman is, but who is this Harry Truman?
So this is the other Harry Truman. This happened in Mount St. Helens in early 1980s. They realized there was this big bulge sticking out of the mountain. They realized the volcano was going to blow pretty soon. They start evacuating people, getting them off the mountain, except Harry Truman refuses to leave the mountain for a couple of reasons. He had been a rum runner back in Prohibition. He went hiding in the forests around Mount St. Helens to basically, I think he was running from gangsters is what they figured out. But he was hiding up there. He eventually opened a cabin up there for tourists and became comfortable there and said, I'm going to stay here. This is my home. He was running the campground with his wife, who unfortunately died a few years before that.
And he wasn't that lucky in love. He kept falling in love with women who didn't really like him back.
Yeah.
So then he married.
He was a little
gets
hard guy to
divorced,
live
he
with,
married,
I think. Yeah.
Finally-
He demanded breakfast of cow brains every single morning, and whole milk is what he had for breakfast every morning. So
But he meets this Edna person who's willing to cook the brains
she
for him.
cooked the brains for him,
Yeah.
every morning.
And he's a bootlegger, and he has his own booze thing going on.
Yeah, even after Prohibition ended, he liked to make his own, he called it Panther Pee. It was whiskey, basically, that he kept out in these stills that he would hide from. There was no reason to do this, but he just kept doing this. And he was just comfortable being in this place on the mountain. And so when they were evacuating people, he said, I'm not going to leave.
Now, his wife had died at this point.
His wife had died a few years
And
earlier.
he's feeling really crummy
He's
about
feeling
that.
low, yeah.
Yeah.
Not doing well.
So he's not a very good cook, so his guests get served hot dog a la something. So some
Soggy
terrible-
hot dogs, and there were
yeah.
peanut butter and onion sandwiches were the other item on the
so
menu.
his
at the-
hospitality skills are less than entirely
Yeah,
admirable.
you wonder if he was kind of driving people away actively at some point.
So now the news comes, there's a swell in this giant volcano, watch out, and everybody stay
Smoke
away.
coming out,
Smoke
yeah.
coming out. Governors and sightseers coming over with Piper Cub planes to look down in violation of everybody and everything.
Uh-huh.
And he's on the ground saying, I shall not leave.
Yep,
And every reporter in America and in Europe and in Asia comes over to visit him.
pretty much, yeah.
Then what happens?
Then what happens is
It's May 18th.
May 18th, 1981, I think, the mountain blows. It finally does blow. And it kind of surprised geologists. They thought it was going to blow out the top. It actually blew out the side of the mountain, unfortunately, right toward where Harry Truman was. And this huge, huge cloud of hot gases came roaring down the mountain, basically wiped out everything in its path.
You want to hear like good prose? Screw you. I'm going to read you
All right.
to talk to you. Given the speed of the black cloud that emerged, up to 350 miles an hour, Truman could have watched it careen down the mountain for maybe a minute, a plume 100 stories tall and 10 miles wide. Its intense heat would have boiled away any nearby snow, twisted those 250-foot fir trees like scraps of plastic in a campfire. When the front roared into Truman's campsite, it would have blistered the paint on his pink Cadillac. He has a pink Cadillac on a volcano.
That was his baby, yeah.
Yeah. Perhaps burst the tires as the air inside them expanded. Every bottle of Shenley's in the cabinet would have exploded like a Molotov cocktail, and all the Panther Pea, you mentioned his bootleg stuff, would have gone up in blue flame. Truman's clothes would have flared, disappeared, then Truman himself would have sublimed in the scientific sense, transformed from solid to spirit almost instantly, and with a final hiss, he would have risen into the air, joining the wider atmosphere. Whoa.
Yep, that was the end of Harry Truman.
That was the end. And now, if I go, a la Caesar, have I got a little Truman?
You might have a little Harry Truman in you as well.
Wow. So let's move on. The book does describe another contemporary event which actually freaked me out. Instead of something as dramatic as a huge volcano, one day in the Cameroons, in an inconspicuous lake called Nyos,
Yep.
something odd happened.
Yeah, it was a big surprise for geologists. So this was a mountain lake in Cameroon, or basically in the crater of a volcano. And they had all these local legends about, spirits that would come down off the mountain. They would suffocate people. And it turned out these legends did have some sort of factual scientific basis, because one day, 1986, no one really knows what exactly happened, but at the bottom of this semi-dormant volcano, all this carbon dioxide had been building up. The weight of the water had been keeping it down, keeping it sort of plugged for a while, for hundreds of years. Then all of a sudden, it got released. It came up in one giant belch, basically, had this huge fountain of carbon dioxide spewing out of this lake.
Can you see a fountain of carbon dioxide, or is it invisible?
Yeah, because it was dragging the water up with
Okay.
it, and dragging this iron-rich water from the bottom of the lake. So it was red water. It would have been like this apocalyptic, like
Woo.
blood fountain, blood-colored fountain coming up. And it was nighttime then, so probably not a lot of people saw it. But unfortunately then, like I said, it was a mountain lake or in a volcano, so it was elevated around above these villages. All this carbon dioxide came out. Carbon dioxide is heavier than air, started to sink, and all this kind of big mass of carbon dioxide started spreading through the local villages. A lot of people were asleep there and basically suffocated everyone who got in its path. They would just sort of fall over. Some of people were tending their fire. They would just keel over. Other people were sleeping. They died in their sleep.
And this is because the CO2 crowds out the O too, and you can't
Yeah, you don't get any
strangle?
oxygen in because there's too much carbon dioxide. It crowds it out.
What if you're like a flea?
That was the other thing. It killed all the cattle in the area, all the mice, all the insects. People said it was a very creepy experience going there the next day because there was no life anyway. I mean, plants made it through, but all the animal life was basically wiped out of this area. So very creepy, very surreal experience.
So this tells you that the Earth still has this capacity to somehow push out what would for us be just toxic gas.
Toxic, yeah, exactly. It's sort of a glimpse of that early, nasty, awful atmosphere that thankfully we don't see very often, but we do get a glimpse now and then.
Well, there is a picture in your footnotes. By the way, if you read this book, when you go to the back, the footnotes are even, they're as good as the book.
Even better, okay.
Yeah, so there's a picture of some dogs looking very unhappy or maybe dead.
Yeah.
And it's called the Cave of Dogs in Italy. What is that?
Yeah, they're not dead, so don't
Okay,
worry about
good.
that. For some reason, they thought it was a very funny sport in this cave in Italy. It was kind of an unusual shaped cave, and so you kind of stepped over this entrance to get into this cave, so there was kind of a lip on it. And carbon dioxide would collect at the bottom of this cave, and people would walk in there. And the human beings were fine because we're tall, we walk on 2 feet, we're above this, we're breathing air. But they would bring dogs in there, and the dogs were low where the carbon dioxide was.
Like if you brought a big dog, like if you brought a sheepdog or a
mastiff or something, yeah, they would be okay. But they would bring little dogs in there, and then they would run around, and then they would pass out. And for some reason, they thought this was a very amusing sport. Like it was a tourist destination.
Well, what would you
for
do
people.
with your fallen small dog?
You just pick it up, you pat it a little bit, it comes back.
Oh God.
So I don't think they actually died, but it was not.
So let me move quickly away from that story to the middle part of the book deals with human relationships with gas. And again, most people are completely rascals, but I'll just make a brief stop at Joseph Priestley, who was in England and then came to Pennsylvania. But if Aristotle said, all right, so air is one thing, we're now at the point, we're in the 17th century, where we're learning that air is got lots of different gases. Priestley was one of the discoverers of that.
Yeah, that's when they started to discover that air wasn't a sort of a monolithic thing. There were different gases in there. And Priestley and another guy, especially Carl Scheele, usually given credit for discovering oxygen, kind of the most important gas as far as we're concerned.
But essentially they're saying this thing, which we can't even see, is actually a complex set of multiple kinds of molecules, and they're figuring, I don't know, this will be testing your ability since you wrote this probably a year and a half ago.
Yeah, okay.
But the discovery of carbon dioxide in a Scottish church, does that ring any bells for you?
Yes,
I
it
love
does.
this.
Okay.
All right.
So they were trying to, Joseph Black, I think was his name. He was trying to discover carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide, they have this substance called, I think, slaked lime or something like that. Basically, it's water with another substance dissolved in it. When exposed to carbon dioxide, it turns cloudy. So it's a very quick, easy way to know if there's carbon dioxide in there. And he was kind of a jokester, and so he snuck up to the rafters of a church and put a basin of this slaked lime up there. And then
on the beams up in the roof.
The beams up on the roof. And then they had a typical Scottish Sunday service for, 7 hours of this preacher preaching and preaching. And then he went up there afterward and he got the basin down, and it was completely clouded over. So all the hot air from the preacher had changed.
So 400 people listening to an overlong sermon exhaled, and thus we discover carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to beat. Nitrous oxide is a subject of great interest to you. It's called laughing gas. Why?
Because it makes you giggle. It's sort of an intoxicant. It's what you get at the dentist, or what you used to get, at least at the dentist's office.
Okay, so speaking of dentists, there's a fellow named Thomas Beddoes and his young assistant Humphrey Davies.
Yep.
Thomas Beddoes, in addition to exposing tubercular patients of his to cow farts, is basically a complete con man, as far as I can tell. And then he goes and hires some 19-year-old kid to help him. What are they going to do together?
So Beddoes' idea was, you might have heard about a theory, an old theory about medicine where diseases were caused by bad air. So malaria literally means bad air. So they thought diseases were caused by bad air. Well, maybe good air then could cure diseases. So he thinks, well, I'm going to make up all these different gases and expose people to them. I'm going to cure consumption this way. I'm going to cure all these diseases that people had. And so he sets up a clinic in Bristol, England to basically do this. And one of the gases he's quite interested in is nitrous. So he gets these people in who have, shriveled hands or whatever. They can't walk. They have tuberculosis in their lungs, whatever. Exposes them to this and tries to see what happens to them. And, they get some results that maybe seem like they might be worth. They're encouraged by it, but the real legacy of it is that Humphrey Davy, who is completely reckless and wants to expose himself to all these gases, figures out that nitrous oxide will get him high, basically, starts inviting all of his friends over, people like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the poet, a bunch of these poets in this district, invites them all over. So by day, they're running all these very serious experiments on patients, And by night, him and his friends are sitting around getting high on this gas that they're making.
Just to give you a sense of how high, again, I'm going to quote you.
Okay.
Another night, he tested the new gas immersion unit from James Watt, the very famous James Watt, whose daughter had tuberculosis, took the nitrous oxide, died, but James Watt was still a believer for some reason. It consisted of a large box with a sedan chair inside. Humphrey Davy entered it half naked, a thermometer tucked in his armpit, a feather fan in his hand to stir the air. Over the course of 75 minutes, an assistant released 300 quarts of nitrous into the chamber. Davy emerged wobbly, flushed red, running a temperature of 106 degrees Fahrenheit. But he insisted on taking one more hit from his silk bag. This rocketed him to the highest high of his life, a new dimension of intoxication. At one point, he declared himself a sublime being, this is a quote, newly created and superior to other mortals. Moments later, he babbled, "Nothing exists but thoughts. The world is composed of impressions, ideas, pleasures, and pains." He sounds like a deranged Bishop Berkeley, but Davy considered such testimony just as valuable as observations on the heart rate or pupil dilation.
Yeah, so he kind of wanted to explore the mental dimensions of these gases as well.
So this becomes like kind of like a recreation, come take the drop, like you go for a drink, you go for a natural.
It does, but it's interesting because Davy wrote this 600-page book where he basically says, these gases aren't really working as medicine. They're interesting physiologically. And then in one single line in this 600-page book, he noticed a few times he was kind of reckless. He would cut himself, or he would have bad headaches, things like that. But he noticed that, every once in a while he would take the nitrous and the pain would go away. And he thought, maybe someday someone could use this in surgery. Just kind of tossed that in there, didn't pay any attention to it. No one paid any attention to it for 40 years. And eventually, as you said, instead of using nitrous as an anesthesia, it became sort of a cheap recreational drug where they would have nitrous frolics, they called them. You would go into a big auditorium. Someone on stage would whip up a batch of nitrous. They would call people onto the stage, get them high, and let them run around doing antics on stage, and you would sit and laugh at them, basically. It was. And
then one day, a boyish-looking dentist goes for a 25-cent street snort of this stuff. His name is Horace Wells, so it's like a snort-in, sort of. And he brings a friend. His friend conks out on a piece of furniture or something.
He barks his shin on the furniture.
Yeah.
And then they both are running around, and the friend kind of comes out of the high, and he's bleeding all over. He's got this huge, massive bruise, and he's in a lot of pain. But for the previous, half hour, he'd been running around on this. And Horace Wells thinks to himself, he's like, that is so strange that you were in this much pain, but you didn't notice it. And he's the one where the light really goes off in his head, and he thinks, oh my God. He sees people in his dental practice every day trying to pull their teeth, and he thinks, this might really be something.
So this being the period where you do self-experimentation, this dentist plops himself into a chair, not his own, and says, pull my tooth, to some other guy. And he feels nothing after having the NO2. So now he decides that this could be a business. I'm a dentist. People don't seem to notice that my teeth. I didn't notice that my tooth was pulled. We can make a business. I just need to know a businessman. The businessman he chooses is named William Morton, who, very briefly, was involved in embezzlement, mail fraud, brought any number of brides which he left at the altar, and then got excommunicated. So that's the business part.
Horace Wells did not have good business judgment. Yeah. But that was the person he chose because he was in, I believe, New Hampshire at the time, and Morton was in Boston, which was the center then of all medicine in the U.S. He needed a contact there, so against his better judgment, maybe he got in touch with Morton. And Morton was a complete confidence man. He arranged for a demonstration at Massachusetts General Hospital, kind of the big hospital at the time. And what they decided to do was extract the tooth of a student. I think everyone had a bad tooth back then, just waiting to get pulled. But they had this demonstration where they called the student down. They gave him nitrous. He was sitting there. And unfortunately, they maybe didn't administer it right, or maybe the student just didn't go under. No one really knows. But as they were pulling the tooth, the student started to move a little bit. He groaned a little bit. Turned out later he wasn't actually conscious of anything. He was just, some people just don't go under that deeply. But they saw him groan, and the crowd that was there to watch this started booing him. They were yelling humbug at him, which was a great insult back then.
Yeah, right. You don't want to be humbugged.
Yeah, and they basically ran him out of town after this.
So that wasn't good news for William Morton and Horace Wells, the dentist and con man. But now the con man, not so much the dentist, but the con man, Morton, who's not a scientist or anything, he decides to test other gases.
Yeah, he still likes the idea of using something as an anesthesia, but he kind of gives up on nitrous. And he remembered when he was younger, he and some friends would sniff ether to get high. And he said, that kind of has a similar effect. Maybe ether could be something. So he ends up going to the family farm and basically drugging a bunch of the cows and the chickens and the animals there to test it on them.
Does he pull their teeth, or what does he do to them?
I think he just watches them pass out, and then
watches them pass out.
Yeah, and tries to figure out the dose that he needs.
There, in one of your wonderful footnotes in this section, you point out that not only does he etherize animals, but he just decides to etherize plants, including that one that bites flies, the one that they made, the Broadway show. Yeah, a Venus flytrap.
Yeah, that's one of the weird things is some anesthesias actually work on plants. And, you wouldn't be able to tell that with a tree or something if it was out. But with a Venus flytrap, you can get it etherized and it'll sit there and a fly or land on it and it just won't do anything. So some of them do work on plants as well.
So when he's etherized all the animals and the Venus flytrap at the family farm, does he now get confidence that he's going to do another demo?
He decides to do another demo, same hospitals, gathers the same doctors, and...
Although this time he's going to have Dr. John Warren, America's premier surgeon of 1840.
The top
blah,
doctor
blah.
in America, yep.
So that's putting a lot of chips on the table.
It was, but that's what he thrived on. He was a competence man, so he was going to get the best doctors there, and he was going to convince them that this was going to work.
And
he decided the night before that he didn't like the delivery method of it, in part because he knew he couldn't get a patent on it. So ether was a very common chemical then. You couldn't really get a patent on it. And he was soaking it in a sponge, basically, or a rag, and exposing, like putting it over people's mouths. So you can't get a patent for doing that to somebody. So he decides he's going to invent this new contraption to make it. The problem is he has no skills building these things. So he gets one of his friends. They spend the night before. They stay up all night building this thing. He has no time to test it. And in fact, he's late for his appointment to, it was I think a house painter. They were going to cut a tumor off his neck. So he's late getting there. They almost start the surgery without him. He comes running in the door. He has this weird looking contraption. And the first time he ever used it was on this patient.
So he's not a scientist. No one has done either before. The house painter is lying there.
He's been up all night.
The elite of Boston are in the room. All the medical students, the world's most famous surgeon, or America's most famous surgeon, and the con man comes in with the weirdo thing he invented overnight.
And he nails it.
He nails it.
He gets it exactly right. The guy goes under perfectly. They do the surgery, and it's a complete success.
And Dr. John Warren says...
Yeah, he turns to the audience and he says, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug."
Yay!
And they start applauding. It was like the greatest moment of his life.
So did William Morton get very, very rich and enforce his patent?
No, after all that work, ether has a very distinct odor, so word got around very quickly that it was ether. And he spent, the next few decades of his life trying to cash in on this success. So the irony was that he was a fairly successful competence man for a long time. He finally invents one of the most important breakthroughs in medical history, and he can't make a dime on it. He just cannot get any money for it.
It is a huge thing. I mean, surgeons up to that moment were the thing you would least want to have happen to you. It was horrible.
There were all these stories of people running away in the middle of surgery, committing suicide rather than face a surgery. It was one of the worst experiences you could go through.
And now this philandering humbuggy man just solves the whole thing.
Solves the whole thing. Yeah.
What about Horace Wells, the dentist who was his partner? has an unfortunate finish.
He meets
too.
an unfortunate end too. He goes into some different businesses. He's like importing exotic birds for a while, doing different things. He eventually
Sends
ends up
fraudulent paintings to American art collectors.
Oh, yeah, that's right. He went to Paris for a while. But in Paris, he's sort of taken as this genius. They think, they hail him, and he got asked to be, I think, one of the emperors of France asked him to be his personal dentist because they'd heard about this success with ether, and it kind of rubbed off on him. So he's thinking, okay, I'm going to go back to the U.S. I'm going to figure something else out. I'm going to, make a name for myself as a scientist like I wanted to. And there had been some word going around that chloroform might be a good anesthesia as well. So he starts inhaling chloroform, doing some tests on himself again. And unfortunately, he ends up kind of addicted to chloroform. And ends up, it's not quite clear what happened, but he ends up attacking some people in the street.
The way you tell it is, he's in New York, now a chloroform addict. A friend comes in and says, "Oh my God, I've just been attacked by 2 prostitutes." "Really?" says the chloroform addict guy. He says, "Yes, and now I want to go and splash acid on the prostitutes." "I think I'll help you," says our...
It seems like a good idea.
Good idea.
Yeah, at the time.
So they run out, and he splashes vitriol, you call it, onto the...
He was trying to ruin their coats, basically, is what.
Coat.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, he ruins one of their faces, so that's not nice. And then he's arrested, and he goes to prison, and they have a huge bail. But then he ducks into the prison bathroom.
Well, he begs to go home to get his things.
Oh, right.
So he goes home. He has one last vial of chlorophyll there, which he kind of palms. He takes it back to the prison along with a razor that he had secreted as well, and he ends up killing himself. He takes the chloroform to kill the pain. He ends up killing himself in prison.
So this is this kind of a book. I mean, things are happening in this book which are profoundly important, but the people who are doing the things that are profoundly important seem profoundly unimportant or crazy or loony or undeserving of the eminence that the book eventually gives them, which is kind of a cool thing to do, to resurrect these nutcases and let me go over balloon flights, because that's kind of crazy too, and let me get to my favorite section of the whole thing, which is Fallout. So we're now going to go into the 20th century. The air is still, now we're in 20th century air. The thing we're going to add to 20th century air is the residue of atomic bombs. What is Operation Crossroads?
So Operation Crossroads took place 1946, so right after World War II. And they had exploded 3 atomic bombs at this point, the Trinity, the Test, and 2 in Japan. But the military was very interested in knowing what the effects were going to be on, say, a fleet of ships at sea. So they go down to the Bikini Atoll down in the South Pacific, kind of a little paradise island. And this wasn't the world's most sophisticated experiment. Basically what they did is they got a bunch of old destroyers, a bunch of old ships, and they just were going to drop an atomic bomb and see what happened. That was all the experiment was.
Well, just for spice, they're going to bring in 5,000 rats,
Oh,
204 goats, 200 pigs, dressed, for the heck of it, in sailor suits.
They dressed them up. They would cut the goats' hairs like human hair. So basically what they were trying to do is...
I'm just trying to imagine the admiral who's in charge of this. But anyway... And make sure you make the piggy coats blue.
And make them nice and sharp, too. Yeah, you want to look good. What they were trying to do, the idea was that they wanted to see would the clothing offer protection, or would it get incinerated and end up doing something awful. So they were trying to test as realistically as possible without having actual sailors there. That was the idea with the animals.
So boom goes the bombs.
And the pictures of that are fantastic. You have this nice, gorgeous beach, all these palm trees, and this gigantic mushroom cloud rising. It is an amazing, amazing picture.
So everybody sees the bomb, and then the next morning, the Seabees and the regular living people come in to inspect, and there they see a swimming pig in the water, happily paddling along. Or unhappily, I don't know how to describe. what mood a
I don't know how
swimming
well
pig
pigs
is.
swim, but
Yeah.
I don't imagine it was happy, no.
Okay, so it's 420 yards from ground zero, this pig. They rescue it. What happens to this pig?
Yeah, the pig had been locked into the toilet of a ship, and had a uniform on. I don't know if it got torn off or what happened exactly, but it escaped the ship, jumped off the boat, and was swimming around in the lagoon trying to figure out where to go when they found it there. No other animals, as far as I know, that were that close survived. So they fished the pig out of the water. It was not in great shape. Its blood count was kind of messed up, which is a symptom of radiation sickness, hair falling out. But eventually it pulled through. The pig survived. It made it.
It has a name. It's called Pig 311.
Pig 311. It was just the number that it was given. It had a tag, I think, in its ear.
It's funny it
or
wouldn't be
something.
named Rolf or something.
Wilbur or something.
Wilbur, yeah. But yeah, Wilbur.
But
It is an amazing pig, actually.
It's some pig, yeah.
So it's swimming around. They pick it up and they
pick it up. It's not doing well, but it eventually pulls through, and it becomes kind of a celebrity. It gets a photo spread in Life magazine, ends up in the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. People are lined up to see this
Why?
pig because there was such an intense interest in atomic things at the time that people just wanted to know or have any sort of connection to the atomic world.
Well, did the
And
pig recover?
The pig, it recovered in the sense that it lived, and
It seemed
they
to
were.
get to weigh like 4.
It ballooned up to a very large weight, and they tried to breed it a few times. It didn't work. But they were kind of using it as propaganda almost to say, atomic weapons aren't that bad. This pig survived. You can see it. Like, things are okay. They're not so bad.
So this leads me to the behavior, not of the pigs, but of the humans. That you
Mm-hmm.
record basically it's a triptych. It's the story of 3 physicists, or at least 2 physicists and a general, all of whom are scientifically knowledgeable and who are more sophisticated than Pig 311. And I frankly don't understand what I'm reading here. It is a deep puzzle to me. The first in the series is a young physicist who is named Harry Dalian. Who's he?
So he was a pretty young guy when he joined they were working on the Manhattan Project, so down in Los Alamos at the time. And he was involved, he was pretty young, he was only 24 when he got there, so young guy. He was involved in some experiments that involved, you would basically take a shell of, a sphere of plutonium, you would build up a nest of reflectors around it and bring it to the point of criticality, but not quite there. So
So the United States has spent an enormous amount of time getting plutonium. And now the war is over, so they don't have any Nazi or any Japanese person to drop it on. But they still want to play with it.
But we're immediately, if you look at the record, General Groves was even halfway, he was head of the Manhattan Project, even halfway through the war, he was saying, we'll take care of the Germans and Japanese, but the Russians are the real problem. So even during the middle of the war, he was already looking at the Russians. So in some sense, work at Los Alamos didn't really slow down because now they have to go after the Russians. So, it's August 1945, and he's still working on these experiments.
And this thing he's got is a sphere?
It's a sphere of plutonium with a coating of nickel around it.
And it weighs about 14 pounds?
About 14 pounds. It is warm to the touch. It's warm all the time because of the radioactivity going on.
It's got a name. It's called Rufus.
Rufus. They called it Rufus.
Yeah, they
was
don't
the
call
name
it Pig
of the
311.
sphere.
This is a
better name,
sphere
yeah.
with a name. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So this might have been the core of a bomb had we dropped a third one on Japan.
It was going to be the core of the third bomb, but we didn't end up using it, so he ran some experiments on it.
So now the deal is, if you're a physicist in this project after the war, you are going to take this sphere and give it a neutron bath of something. What are you doing?
So what
You want to make it almost blow up? Is that the?
It's not quite going to blow up because plutonium, you need to crush it into a smaller bit before it blows up. But it can go critical in the sense you get a chain reaction and all these neutrons start spewing out, and it will kill you very quickly.
Why would you play with why would you do this?
There was this sort of macho sense at the time where they kind of loved the danger of it, of being around.
Is that why you do it? Because you can? And because you're like a a radioactive cowboy?
That is part of the reason that they were doing it in the way they were doing it, not behind, glass, not with any lead covering. There were some good science. There was good science to be done, but they were doing it in that way because they were a little macho about it.
All right, so there's Harry. He's in Los Alamos, New Mexico. He's got the sphere in his ungloved hands. It's warm to the touch, and he puts it in the right place, and now stuff is happening. The microphone in him goes crackle, 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 crackle.
The radiation detector crackling.
So he's getting closer to a chain reaction. God knows why. This is fun. And then he drops the thing.
What he did is he was putting these bricks around it that were reflecting neutrons back, and when the neutrons get reflected back, they contribute to the chain reaction. So you build up a nest around it, they reflect it back, and he had the last brick, and he was sort of waving it over, kind of hearing the crackle of the radiation detector getting closer, and then he dropped it, and it fell on there, and he tried to bat it away. It was a heavy brick. He couldn't get it. He hit it a few times. It finally went away. And the sphere turned blue too. It started glowing blue, and he knocked it away. And then he had this moment where he's like, okay, and he sort of relaxed a bit. But then he realized that I'm dead, and he knew he was dead because he didn't feel anything at the time. But he realized that he had just let the sphere go critical, and he realized I am dead now. I am not going to survive this.
He had just had in his right hand the equivalent of 400,000 chest X-rays in that moment. They would blister. They would get essentially a three-dimensional sunburn because he was burning from the inside and the outside of his body. He goes into a coma. He's in the hospital. His family gets paid $10,000, which is essentially hush money. And at his bedside is his friend, Louis Slotin. You're not going to believe this next part. Who is Louis Slotin?
So he was a young Canadian scientist who was probably even more reckless than Harry Daghlian was. Slotin was involved in what they called the tickling the dragon experiments, where they had another sphere of plutonium, Rufus again, and they were again trying to bring it to the point of criticality. And Slotin had...
Slotin is a scientist, right?
He's a scientist, yeah. He is actually the one who armed Trinity, the bomb. So he's the one who put everything in place and said, okay, we push the button and it goes.
So he's already bombed the city. He knows what he's doing, and now he's back tickling the dragon.
Back tickling the dragon.
Okay. Now, on one occasion, since he volunteers to click the dragon, and he says, there's a big tank, a nuclear reaction going on in a tank. And Lou says, can we fix this tank? Because I want to... And they say, no, you wait for the weekend. The engineers are off for the weekend. Then sometime during the weekend, Lou strips his jeans and cowboy boots off, dives into the pool with the reactor still blazing. Why did I write this? 242. Maybe this is another
to
moment.
fix the experiment, yeah.
Yeah, hold on. One time, needing to make some adjustments to a live nuclear reaction taking place in a tank of water, he asked the maintenance crew to shut the equipment down. It was Friday. The crew said, no, wait till the weekend. When they returned Monday morning, the changes had already been made. Well, had Slotin shut the equipment down himself? Nope, he just stripped off his jeans and his cowboy boot, dived into the tank with the reactor still blazing, and fixed it himself. Really? Fermi, the famous Fermi, says to him, kid, if you keep this up, you're going to be dead in a year. All right, now what happens to him?
So he was doing, as I said, the tickling the dragon experiment. So you had a sphere of plutonium, and what you would do is you would have a shell, a hemispheric shell of beryllium, and you would what most scientists did is they built up a bunch of wood around it, very thin wood shims, and you would remove these wood shims one by one, and you would slowly lower the beryllium over the plutonium sphere, and you would bring it up to criticality very slowly. Slotin thought that was boring, it took too much time, so he would balance this hemisphere on one end like this, and then get a screwdriver on the other side, and he would sort of pump it up and down, and he thought that was kind of a funny thing to do, was having this hemisphere go pumping up and down, and he would say, he'd be like, whoa, whoa, and like bring it to the point of a chain reaction. Until one day, he was trying to train somebody new on how to do this experiment, when inevitably his hand slipped, The screwdriver slipped out. The hemisphere fell on top of the plutonium. Again, you saw that blue glow going on, and he ended up slapping the sphere off of there. Probably saved everyone in the room by doing that instead of running away, which is kind of your instinct. But he probably saved the other people in the room. But he himself, because he went up and did that, knocked it off, ended up back in the hospital. In fact, ended up in the same bed that his friend Harry did in the hospital. And now people were coming to watch him slowly deteriorate.
Wait, I think these people are nuts. Now, to top it off, there's a third part of this. In the room, next to Harry, next to Lewis,
Slotin,
next to Lewis, is a guy named Alvin Graves. He's standing right behind Lewis when Lewis has to slap the thing and takes a 200,000 chest X-ray hit on his hand and then will go and die. So now this guy, Alvin Graves, is standing right behind him. Alvin Graves is exposed. When Lou leaves the room, he says to the lady sitting, I said, could you do a quick calculation? I'm just trying to figure out, there was this guy behind me.
Yeah, hypothetically.
Hypothetically, like how many? So she says, well, let's see. He was probably at a 35,000 X-ray exposure. What Lou didn't know was that he was talking to Alvin Graves' wife. She was measuring the exposure that her husband had just received, who was Harry's friend, who was Lewis's friend, who was Harry's friend. So now we have Alvin, the third member of this weird troika, who is now watching Louis die. Now you'd think at this point somebody would go, we've got to stop doing this. We've got to just give this up, or I have to walk away. What did Alvin Graves do?
Alvin Graves ended up getting cataracts, so his vision deteriorated. He ended up spending a lot of time at home, sleeping for 16 hours a day, hair falling out. They were doing tests. His sperm count dropped to 0 at one point. A lot of ill health effects. But he decides that he's still big in favor of nuclear bombs. And he ends up 10 years later directing nuclear bomb tests in the South Pacific. So he goes to the South Pacific, starts running some of these tests, including the big notorious test, the Castle Bravo, I believe, test.
Biggest bomb ever, yeah.
Yeah, the big tests. And so he decides he's going to keep pushing it. And he, ends up detonating some kind of notorious nuclear bombs down there.
So how do you, and then there's one other thing, just before I go to the big question here. There's a footnote in which you describe a lecture in the 1930s called The Wonders of Radioactivity. And a Nobel laureate, Ernest Lawrence, of Lawrence Livermore Laboratories, like a very famous man.
Yep, cyclotron inventor, yeah.
He takes a vial of radioactive sodium and puts a Geiger counter on it. Goes so much so that it just goes off the charts. So he just
it was too intense.
Too intense. So he just pours some salt water onto the radioactive salt, and then he invites Robert Oppenheimer, a totally accomplished physicist, onto the stage, and Oppie looks at this solution, which is now radioactive salt with salt water added, and goes
down the hatch,
and then takes the Geiger counter against his chest and goes, and everybody laughs.
They thought
At
it was
which point
it was
I
a
thought
good
I would
party
just
trick.
shoot myself. I don't understand, honestly, when you parade these people at the beginning of a period in which they know, but most of us don't, but they know that these are restless atoms that are throwing off ions, and the ions hurt. Do you understand this lack of caution? Do you understand, is this optimism? Is this youth? What is wrong with these people?
It was just the culture at the time that you didn't, again, it was sort of a macho culture where you didn't take it seriously, and part of it was a bravado that you were invincible. You were going to beat radioactivity.
When you wrote these stories, were you like wide-eyed in amazement, or were you just thinking, well, just another day in the office for these cowboys and cowgirls?
what I heard about one. What did amaze me is kind of what I think caught your attention was I heard about one, and then there was maybe a mention of something else, and I was like, oh, okay, and I'll look up the second one, realized it was just as bad, and then there was a little mention of another one, looked that up, it was just as bad, and it just kind of kept going like that, a chain reaction of stupidity among them.
Well, because I know we're getting close to the end of this, I'm supposed to finish this, but let me just take you to right now. Right now, we live in a world where our cumulative behavior, we're driving all these cars and burning coal and all this stuff, and it looks like our behavior as a species is a little bit out of control, given what we know we are doing, and yet we do it anyway. And so there has been in the last year or two a tilt from people who are trying to figure out what to do about climate change and all that. It's like, well, bring on the engineers, they say. Like, why not, like, put stuff in the sky or stuff in the ocean so that we can deflect sunshine, or we can draw CO2 out of the air into the sea, and we are giving these Oppenheimers and these Lou Slotons, and we're saying, like, you're smart, you're optimistic, you do it. And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, I don't really know about engineers and engineering. And yet, in your book, on page 318...
Oh, here come the hard-hitting questions. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, you're talking about climate engineering, about things that one might do. And he says, this is you talking. For me, climate engineering, taking deliberate steps to cool our atmosphere, seems like the only realistic solution, even though it looks desperate and insane, and there's a decent chance we'll foul things up royally and make matters worse. But really, what can we do? It's best to rally around when things get desperate and then start building shit, you say. And I'm reading that and I'm thinking, or let's not. This is a book largely about odd people doing brilliant things. In every chapter, you kind of bite your nails wondering which way it's going to go. In many cases, because you would not tell the stories of the people for whom it went nowhere, this tilts in favor of deeds over misdeeds. But I'm going to ask you, knowing what you know about all these people and how change works, why are you comfortable with the idea of handing the engineers, so giving them the room and the power to solve what we as a species don't seem to be able to solve?
It's less a matter of being comfortable with it and just thinking about what the alternatives are. And like I said in the book, it's not a good solution necessarily. Seems a little desperate, but we have some hard choices. And so far, we have not made any hard choices. We've just kept going with things the way they are, and things are probably not going to improve a lot unless we sort of radically cut consumption, which doesn't seem like a lot of people want to do that. It's a tough choice to make. And also, we would need to basically put brakes and hit pause on the rest of the world, trying to develop economies in places like India, China, over 2 billion people in those places that are moving up their standards of living. It doesn't seem like consumption is going to stop, or this production of these gases are going to stop anytime soon. So strictly from a realistic point of view, a cynical point of view perhaps, but a realistic point of view, I'm not sure what other solutions there are that are going to work.
And if you were to game it, if you were to say, okay, Mr. Tesla, okay, Mr. Apple, okay, Mr.
Edison, maybe.
Mr. Edison, Mr. Microsoft, go ahead and do your best. How tightly are your fingers crossed? To the point where they're white as snow? Or do you feel that maybe that ingenious people are ingenious enough to rescue us in a moment of need?
I'm optimistic, I think. I think they can get it done. There are some that they talk about that nature has sort of done the experiment, like putting sulfur dioxide in the air from volcanoes, reflecting sunlight into space. So we know that works. We don't know if it's going to be a good idea over the long term. Another option is to somehow get the carbon dioxide out of the air, to solidify it, get it into a solid form. That one has the benefit of not changing things out there in the larger world. So there are some solutions that are climate engineering, but that maybe aren't as radical as spraying things into the air or something like that. But
Well, all right. I don't normally do this, but this is really a good book. I mean, when I was reading it, I was calling him up in the middle of reading it and saying, "Oh my God!" And I really liked his other ones, but this one is just, it's really, it's one crazy person after another. So, and it does pose the deep question of how we are going to solve ourselves, and whether weird people who are inspired might just win the day, or the day will end badly. And it doesn't answer that question, but it poses it in so many different and interesting ways. I kind of highly recommend that. You're going to be signing books, and are you going to sell them and stuff? Yeah, okay. So if you want to buy one, and he'll be here, I guess. Does anybody have a question, or we could just stop? Although that's the person whose mouth.
I just time for a couple of questions.
Yeah.
An observation to what you were asking, which is, wasn't there a lake that was caught on fire years ago, and they managed to fix that, right? They got the pollution out of that lake, and
in where?
in here in America, there was some lake that got so polluted it actually caught on fire at some point, and they brought it back. And
You're
made
talking the Cuyahoga River in
In
Cleveland?
Cleveland.
yeah,
caught on
and they
fire,
made
yeah.
it healthy again. So there are,
Well,
right?
it burned, and so that was weird. I don't think if you'd go to the Cuyahoga now and skinny dip, would you?
I would not.
No. I'm not sure it's solved. It's just not on fire.
Right, but it was rehabilitated, and also there was, like in England, when they had those like great dark days of so much smoke in the air that you
Yes.
couldn't, right?
Oh, well, Los Angeles, yeah.
Right. So there is quite a bit of hope out there in terms of
mean-
what we've done in terms of rehabilitating the Earth, and the Earth is extraordinarily resilient in a lot of ways. Yes, we are pushing it to. Many people are saying we can't get back. It's going to start a cascade of some kind, like the cascade of
It has a momentum that,
Yeah, like Alzheimer's gets to a point where, if you don't catch it sooner, you can maybe do something about it. They think although new stuff is coming out about that. But just in terms of like throwing out more hope towards the question you were posing towards him, the crazy people are the ones that take the risks in some ways. You look back on science, and there's the guy dead at the table in front of 6 compounds. One of those did him in, but the other 5 he wrote notes on, and we learned something. It's those people that take those risks, like, here, taste this. No, you taste it. All right, well, that got me somewhere. Or
See, like you're on the side of the room that I'm not, but that's like that's what makes it fun. I think is like do you want to be on the optimist team or the uh-oh team?
You're not the optimist.
No, I am the optimist.
You are the optimist.
Well,
I don't know how this
No, I'm not.
factors
That's
in a
right,
little
that's
bit,
right.
but there's a
I'm
book
not.
out now called The Radium Girls. You know about that, right?
know about it, yeah.
During the war, they painted, clocks with radium and watches with it, and it would glow in the dark.
You're right.
And the company knew that this was radium. They knew it was going to kill people. The ordinary people didn't know. Now today, with internet and everything, more people know a little bit of what the engineers know. But I mean, these women died horrible deaths, and they used to use paintbrushes, and they used to lick the paintbrush and paint it on the clock. So these women just died horribly. And to make a long story short, the company had no liability in the end, none. I mean, these women got paid $300, and they died horrible deaths. But the company got out of
So
it
you're-
completely. I'm just saying, I'm wondering if there's like some kind of ethical overseer of these brilliant, nutty people who are going to guide us.
I
I
would
don't
hope so. I
know.
mean, like you have the Mad Hatters. These are people in the hatting business who all went crazy too, for whatever it was they were ingesting. Yes, I think you have to. I think if we do this, if we say to the engineers, "Okay, your turn," I would hope that wise people would make that decision. I don't know how or exactly how that would work, but I would hope. I mean, this could happen on a small scale by somebody operating without any supervision. It could happen on a larger scale. It could happen on a national scale, or it could happen on an international scale. And I don't really know what's about to happen. But you all got here through the thick heat and the whatever, so you are to be congratulated. So I'm just going to say thank you for coming and hang out for the book signing and stuff.
Thank you.